My name is Lauren Hayes. I'm 34 years old, and if you looked at my life from the outside, you'd see a structural engineer running a quiet, stable, two-person firm in Nashville, Tennessee. You'd see someone who spends her days in field boots, analyzing blueprints, calculating load-bearing capacities, and looking at spreadsheets. It's the kind of work that doesn't get framed on a wall, but it's the work that determines whether a roof stays over your head or collapses under the weight of a storm. But tonight, I'm not sitting in my office. I'm sitting at my kitchen table on the fourth floor of my apartment building, watching the last of the evening light bounce off a tiny, distant slice of the Cumberland River. My hands are wrapped around a cup of tea that's slowly cooling down, and right next to me on the table are two objects. One is a small 6-inch steel level with brass fittings, its bubble permanently resting just slightly off-center. The other is a glossy, folded university graduation program. I want to ask you something before we go any further. Pour yourself something warm, sit down with me, and really think about this. Have you ever had to sit in the absolute back row of your own family's narrative? Have you ever been forced into a corner, made to feel invisible, while your family celebrated someone else just for existing? If you've ever had to quietly build your own foundation in the dark while the people who were supposed to love you tried to shake it, then I want you to drop your first name and your city in the comments right now. Let me know who is sitting at this table with me tonight, because this story is for you. To understand why these two objects are sitting side by side on my table, we have to go back to the exact geometry of a hot, echoing university gymnasium on a Saturday afternoon in May. It was my younger brother Derek's college graduation. If you've ever been to one of these events, you know the atmosphere. The acoustic chaos of a sports facility trying its best to play the role of a grand concert hall. The heavy hum of 300 families packed into folding chairs, all waiting for a single moment of public validation. When we arrived, my mother directed our seating with the flawless efficiency of a military general. She had printed out the graduation program, used a bright pen to circle Derek's name, and arranged 4 pristine, reserved seats in the front section right in the third row, directly facing the stage. Those premium seats were saved for my father, my mother, my aunt, and a close family friend who had driven up for the big event. My mother turned to me at the entrance, handed me a program, and told me, without a single hint of hesitation or warmth, that the reserved seats were strictly for the people who had actually been there to support Derek through his journey. She said there was plenty of room for me in the back. She didn't say it to start an argument. She said it as if it were a fundamental law of nature. I was the family footnote, and footnotes belong at the very bottom, out of sight. So I walked up the concrete steps alone, found a seat in the absolute last row of the auditorium, and placed my bag on my lap. Inside that bag was my grandfather's old steel level, a heavy little rectangle of metal that I've carried with me every single day for 12 years. I rested my hand against it, feeling its weight, and watched my family from 50 feet away. Sitting in the absolute back row of that gymnasium, you get a very specific perspective on human behavior. You are far enough away to detach yourself from the emotion of the room, but close enough to see the structural alignment of everything playing out below. From 50 feet back, I watched my father's broad shoulders in his good jacket and my mother's pristine posture as she adjusted the printed program in her lap. They were fully locked into the narrative they had spent months organizing in their minds. To them, this afternoon was the ultimate verification of their parenting, the crown jewel in the family scrapbook. Then, the announcer called Derek's row to stand. I watched from my isolated vantage point as my brother rose, straightening his graduation gown with that casual, unbothered confidence he has carried his entire life. The moment his name echoed through the gymnasium's strained sound system, my father was already on his feet. He didn't just stand. He surged upward, throwing his arms into the air, leading a massive, thunderous standing ovation. Around him, 300 people in that auditorium erupted into applause, their claps bouncing off the metal rafters and filling the space with a deafening roar. It was a beautiful sight, honestly. If you didn't know the physics of our family, you would have looked at them and seen a picture-perfect portrait of unconditional love and celebration. But I knew the structure. As the applause reached its peak, my mother did something that completely casual celebration of casual celebration. She didn't just look at the stage. She turned her head, searching through the crowded rows of clapping strangers until her sharp eyes locked onto me, sitting alone in the dark corner she had assigned to me. She leaned across the empty folding chair next to her, tilted her chin upward, and raised her voice just enough to pierce through the heavy wall of applause. She said, loud enough for the entire row of strangers in front of us to hear, that I had always been the family's true disappointment. She told me that Derek had worked so incredibly hard to earn a moment of real significance like this, and then she paused, letting her eyes scan my casual gray blazer before adding that I could have had a moment like this too, if I had ever actually applied myself. Before I could even process the cold precision of that strike, she turned back toward the stage, her hands neatly coming together to rejoin the applause, completely satisfied with the private humiliation she had just publicly delivered. I didn't blink. I didn't yell. When you spend your life analyzing concrete and steel, you learn that reacting to a sudden stress load with explosive emotion is exactly how a structure breaks. Instead, I simply closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, reached into my bag, and wrapped my fingers around the cool, weighted metal of my grandfather's level. I thought about what he always told me about things that are built correctly. They don't cry out for attention, they just hold. I opened the glossy program in my lap to the very back page, a section I hadn't bothered to look at when we first sat down. My eyes scanned down the left column, past the standard university boilerplate text, until they locked onto a single line printed in the exact same clean, unadorned font as everything else around it. Hayes Mercer Engineering Scholarship, established 2020. Lauren Hayes, founder. I slowly closed the program, my thumb resting on the cover. Down on the stage, the applause was finally beginning to settle as the dean, Dr. Patricia Aldridge, walked back to the central microphone. She adjusted her papers, waited for the 300 people to quiet down, and then she didn't read the next student's name. She looked directly out into the crowd, took a deep breath, and said my name into the microphone. Not Derek's, mine. In the third row, I watched my mother and father instantly freeze, their bodies locking up like an unreinforced wall in a sudden earthquake. To understand the absolute stillness that came over my parents in that exact second, you have to look beneath the surface of Robert and Diane Hayes. You have to understand the specific architectural flaws in how they constructed their reality. My father, Robert, is a man who has spent over 3 decades working in commercial insurance. He understands risks on paper, he has a remarkably firm handshake, and he projects a type of surface warmth that is completely genuine but strictly limited to the surface. He loves his family the way someone loves a well-staged, high-resolution photograph of their family, with a deep, emotional attachment to the clarity of the image, but from a safe distance that ensures he never has to deal with the messy, unpolished realities behind it. In 34 years, he has never once asked me a question about my engineering firm that suggested he actually understood, or cared to understand, what a structural engineer does. To him, a career only matters if it comes with a recognizable corporate title that he can drop casually into a conversation at a golf course. My mother, Diane, is even more precise. She worked as a medical receptionist for 22 years, a job that is entirely about managing first impressions, triaging chaos, and making sure the waiting room looks completely orderly no matter what crisis is happening behind the closed office doors. She took those exact professional skills and applied them to our family narrative. She is the self-appointed chief historian of the Hayes family. She is the one who scripts who we are at Sunday church services, at neighborhood dinner parties, and at every single social gathering we have ever attended. But for over 30 years, her carefully constructed narrative has had one massive underlying structural problem. Me. I am incredibly difficult to explain to people who need life summarized in a 20-second elevator pitch. I don't wear expensive corporate suits. I wear steel-toed field boots covered in dried mud from construction sites. I don't manage a massive team in a high-rise. I run a lean, intense, two-person operation where we spend our nights staring at complex structural load spreadsheets and concrete curing schedules. My mother has never been interested in the fine print of life. She hates footnotes. Whenever her friends ask what I do, she quickly dismisses it with a vague, airy phrase. "Oh, Lauren does something with buildings." I corrected her exactly once, explaining the heavy mathematical responsibility of structural integrity, but it didn't fit her script, so the description never changed. My brother Derek, however, is completely legible. He earned a standard business administration degree focused on marketing, a field that is literally about packaging and selling an attractive narrative. He is 28, exceptionally charming, calls my parents every single Sunday without fail, and laughs at every single one of my father's stale jokes. The family story of Derek is beautifully simple, perfectly clear, and requires absolutely no explanation or footnotes. He is the golden child because he represents the path of least resistance for my mother's public relations campaign. I want you to pause for a second and think about your own life. If this is hitting anywhere close to home, if you've ever realized that your family didn't actually love you, but rather loved an easy-to-explain, performative version of you, I want you to type the word legible in the comments right now. Because for a long time, I thought I was broken just because I didn't fit into their shallow two-dimensional picture frame. I had to learn that a structure doesn't need to be pretty to the untrained eye to be completely unshakable. The reason I didn't snap or break down when my mother called me a disappointment in that crowded gymnasium is because my foundation wasn't poured by her. It was built by my grandfather, Walter Mercer. He was a civil engineer who spent 35 years of his life building the kind of unglamorous, heavy infrastructure that holds entire cities together without ever announcing itself. He built drainage systems, concrete overpasses, and water management grids. Nobody ever takes photographs of those things, and nobody ever names high-rise buildings after the people who design them. But if they fail, everything else comes crashing down. My grandfather believed with a quiet, absolute certainty that doing a job correctly and doing it quietly were exactly the same discipline. He used to tell me that true quality and emotional restraint came from the exact same deep place in a person's character. The structures that were truly worth building were the ones that would be completely forgotten the very second they were completed, simply because they worked so perfectly that nobody ever had a reason to question them. When I was 7 years old, he started taking me along to his active job sites on Saturday mornings. I remember standing next to him at the edge of a massive, muddy excavation pit, wearing a bright yellow work jacket that was at least 2 sizes too large for me, watching him work. He knelt in the red clay, placed his calloused hand over mine, and guided my fingers along a crisp paper survey blueprint. "Look at the lines, Lauren," he murmured softly over the roar of the diesel engines. "Check the surface twice before you ever trust it with a single ounce of weight. A fast foundation looks perfectly fine for years, right up until the moment it doesn't." He taught me how to read a survey, how to hold a level properly, and how to watch the tiny amber bubble settle between the black lines without rushing it. When he passed away during my second year of college from a brutal case of pancreatic cancer that took him in a matter of weeks, he left me exactly one thing. It wasn't a massive sum of money or a piece of property. It was a small 6-inch steel pocket level with worn brass fittings. The bubble inside was permanently off-center because it had taken a hard fall onto a concrete floor sometime back in the late 1980s. He had never once had it recalibrated. Before he closed his eyes for the last time in that hospice room, he placed that heavy little tool into my palm and told me that a perfect tool only teaches you how to measure, but an imperfect tool forces you to think. I have carried that specific level in my work bag for 12 straight years. I don't use it to pull actual measurements on my job sites. I just pull it out when a project gets incredibly complicated or when the noise of the world gets too loud, just to hold it, feel the cool weight of the metal, and think. Sitting in the back row of that graduation, my hand was resting right against it through the fabric of my bag. My mother's words were just a surface vibration, but my grandfather's level was solid weight. The emotional dismissal I experienced at the graduation wasn't a sudden structural failure. It was simply the latest data point in a generational pattern that started early enough for me to track its exact coordinates all the way back to middle school. I was in the 7th grade when the school held its annual science fair. While the other kids were building baking soda volcanoes or pasting colorful pictures onto trifold boards, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my grandfather's old leather-bound engineering notebook, calculating stress distributions. I built a model bridge using nothing but thin balsa wood and precise geometric calculations I had worked out myself. On the day of the testing, my bridge held 40 pounds of iron weights before the first splinter finally cracked. It didn't just win. It shattered the school's historical record for weight capacity. I was handed a first-place blue ribbon and a crisp certificate, and the science teacher stood right in front of my parents and told them that I possessed a rare, instinctive talent for structural thinking. My parents smiled, shook the teacher's hand, and took the certificate. But that wasn't the story that survived the drive home. That exact same afternoon, Derek had scored a hat trick in his middle school soccer game. For the next 12 months, at every single family dinner, every holiday gathering, and every casual conversation with neighbors, my mother retold the epic sagas of Derek's soccer game. My bridge, my calculations, and my blue ribbon were never mentioned again. It wasn't that they explicitly told me my achievement didn't matter. They simply erased it from the family ledger by refusing to give it any vocal oxygen. By the time I reached high school, I had stopped expecting them to show up to my court. When I won second place in the state mathematics competition, an honor that came with a small academic scholarship to cover my future textbooks, my parents weren't even in the auditorium to watch me walk across the stage. The ceremony conflicted with Derek's junior varsity regional basketball game, and in the economy of our household, the main event had already been decided months in advance. I didn't argue or pitch a fit. I was 16 years old, and I simply adjusted my expectations to match the reality of the structure. I drove myself to the State University auditorium in our old family sedan, sat quietly in the folding chairs, surrounded by other competitors and their cheering parents, and walked up to receive my certificate alone. When the ceremony ended, I drove back home in the dark, walked up the stairs to my bedroom, and slid the certificate into a cardboard box. I didn't tell a single soul in the house what had happened that day. When I eventually moved out for college, that box came with me. When I moved back to Nashville to start my career, it went straight into the bottom drawer of my office cabinet. I haven't opened it in years, but I know exactly where it sits. When it came time for college, I chose a large state university because its structural engineering program was deeply rigorous, and because it was the exact same institution where my grandfather had earned his own degree decades earlier. I paid for every single credit hour myself through a combination of partial academic scholarships, federal student loans, and a grueling part-time job working at the university's facilities and maintenance office. Ironically, I learned more practical, real-world engineering during those 2 years fixing leaking water mains and inspecting cracked retaining walls for the university than I did in half of my advanced lecture courses. I graduated summa cum laude. My parents did manage to attend that graduation, but their presence was purely transactional. The second we stepped out into the crowded concrete parking lot afterward, amidst the sea of families taking photos, my mother gave me a quick, distracted hug and said, "We're so proud of you, honey." Before the sentence could even land, she seamlessly pivoted the conversation to talk about Derek's upcoming enrollment at the exact same university. They had been planning his move-in day for months, discussing his dorm layout and his future social prospects with the kind of intense, high-energy focus you reserve for a grand theatrical opening. My graduation was treated like a brief, necessary intermission before the main act could begin. Once again, I got into my car and drove back to my apartment completely alone, watching the taillights of my parents' vehicle disappear down the highway ahead of me. As I moved into my adult life, I realized that trying to rewrite my parents' internal script was a complete waste of structural energy. You cannot force someone to see the value of a foundation if they are entirely focused on the paint color of the living room walls. So, I stopped trying. Every single family gathering over the next 6 years followed a rigid, predictable script that I could have recited from memory with my eyes closed. We would sit around the dinner table, and my father would enthusiastically describe the upward trajectory of Derek's career. He would talk about a recent promotion at the boutique marketing firm Derek worked for, implying a massive financial bonus through an elevated tone of voice rather than stating any actual numbers directly. He framed Derek's life as a flawless golden arc of traditional corporate success. When the spotlight inevitably shifted toward my end of the table, my career was either completely ignored or reduced to my mother's standard, patronizing summary. "Lauren is still doing her little thing with buildings," delivered in a flat tone that wasn't explicitly malicious, but functioned as a complete dismissal anyway. I remember Christmas exactly 2 years ago. I was in the kitchen helping to wash the heavy dinner dishes, my hands submerged in warm, soapy water. My father was around the corner in the living room, completely unaware that the acoustics of the old house carried his voice straight through the drywall. I heard him laughing with an old family friend, and then his voice dropped into a tone of quiet, settled conviction. He said that Derek was truly the only one of his children who had ever made something substantial of themselves. The words hit the back of my neck like a cold draft. I stood there over the sink, a wet porcelain plate in my hand, listening to the laughter resume in the other room. I didn't drop the plate. I didn't march into the living room to start an explosive family confrontation. Instead, I thought about my grandfather's old 6-inch steel level sitting inside my work bag in the dark entryway of the house. I thought about his quiet voice telling me that the best structures are the ones nobody ever notices, because they simply hold. By that point in my life, I had been building something massive for 4 straight years. Something my parents knew absolutely nothing about, because I had deliberately chosen to keep it entirely separate from their narrative. I had reached a point where my engineering firm was no longer just surviving. We had stabilized to the point where we were no longer afraid of failing. I had real financial breathing room for the first time in my adult life, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. I didn't need a billboard, and I certainly didn't need my mother to write a script about it. My grandfather had attended college on a strict need-based scholarship back in the 1960s. He was the son of a furniture repairman from a tiny rural town outside Knoxville, and that single piece of institutional aid was the exact mechanism that made every single subsequent thing in his life possible. He used to talk about it sometimes on our Saturday morning job site visits, not in some grand, sweeping speech, but just as a simple, quiet fact placed into the middle of a conversation and left there to rest. When I returned to Nashville at 29 and started digging out the foundation for my own engineering firm, I found myself thinking about that scholarship a lot more than I ever expected to. I had been incredibly lucky in ways he never was. I had access to better federal aid programs, more institutional support, and most importantly, I had a grandfather who had already done the grueling work of being the first one through the door. I had gotten further and faster in my career partly because of the invisible structural foundation he had built for me to inherit. So, 4 years ago, when my firm's financial spreadsheets finally showed a consistent, comfortable surplus, and I felt true breathing room, for the very first time I didn't buy a luxury car or post a boastful status update online. Instead, I quietly dialed the number for the university's development office. Over the next 3 years, I structured a permanent endowment fund, contributing a total of $120,000. The money was specifically allocated to support incoming engineering students who demonstrated both severe financial need and exceptional academic promise. I named it the Hayes Mercer Engineering Scholarship, entirely in honor of my grandfather, Walter Mercer, who had graduated from that very institution in 1967 and taught me everything I will ever know about what structures are actually for. I did not tell a single member of my family that I was doing this. It wasn't because I was playing a game of strategy, and it wasn't because I was carefully building towards some dramatic, theatrical reveal. I kept it a secret simply because the endowment was a private matter between me, my grandfather's memory, and the future students who would receive it. None of that required my parents' knowledge, their validation, or their particular brand of performative family pride that always seemed to be about dressing up their own image rather than supporting the actual person standing in front of them. The university went ahead and placed a small brushed bronze plaque in the central lobby of the main engineering building. I saw it exactly once, during an unrelated site visit for a structural renovation project 2 years ago. I stood in front of that wall for less than 30 seconds, reading the clean text. Hayes Mercer Engineering Scholarship. Established 2020. Lauren Hayes, founder. Then I turned around, took out my blueprints, and went to assess the building's load-bearing concrete walls, which was what I had actually come to do. I hadn't set foot back on that campus since. I want you to drop the word boundaries in the comments right now if you've ever built an entire empire in the dark, while the people around you constantly projected their own failures onto your shoulders. There is a profound, unshakable power in knowing your work is entirely real without needing a single person in your immediate circle to applaud it. The foundation holds because it was mixed correctly, not because a crowd stood around to watch it pour. When Derek's sleek graduation invitation arrived in my mailbox back in March, I didn't hesitate. My parents called me the exact evening to make absolutely sure I was planning to attend. My mother's voice carried that familiar, polished lilt as she insisted it would mean the world to Derek if the whole family was present. I believed her, mostly because Derek had never been directly unkind to me. He was comfortably, perpetually oblivious, the lifelong center of a flattering family narrative he had never been forced to question. But he wasn't malicious. So, I told her I would be there. On that Saturday morning in May, I made the 2.5-hour drive from Nashville, watching the lush Tennessee spring scenery pass by my windows. It was a stunning, generous day. But the real turning point of that entire weekend didn't happen in the crowded gymnasium. It happened in the quiet confines of my hotel room at exactly 7:45 a.m. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. The caller ID showed a campus exchange number. When I answered, a woman named Carol from the university's donor relations team spoke in an apologetic but remarkably clear tone. She explained that their database had flagged my name on the graduation attendance list, and they had realized the founder of the Hayes Mercer Endowment would actually be in the building. She told me that the department felt incredibly strongly that the occasion warranted some form of public acknowledgement, and she was calling to ask if I would allow the dean to make a brief public mention before the ceremony concluded. I said no immediately. Then I said no a second time. I refused because the entire philosophy behind the scholarship was anchored in my grandfather's belief that true structures work quietly, without needing a spotlight. The idea of standing up in a massive room, flanked by a family that had spent decades projecting a narrative of failure onto me, felt in the abstract like a cheap, performative theatrical stunt. I didn't want to participate in their brand of public image management, even if the roles were reversed. But then Carol said something that completely shifted the weight of the conversation. She told me that 3 of the active scholarship recipients were actually walking across the stage in today's graduating class. She mentioned one student, specifically, a young woman named Isabel Reyes, who had written a line in her original application that Carol had never forgotten. Isabel had written that she was the first future engineer in the history of her family, and her greatest dream was to someday name a project after the anonymous person who had made her education financially possible. Carol told me that Isabel had spent 3 years trying to discover the identity of her donor, but the office had strictly honored my privacy. She said, "Lauren, Isabel is going to be sitting in that room today. She deserves to know that her foundation is real." I sat on the edge of the bed looking at my boots. I didn't say yes for my mother, and I certainly didn't say yes for my father. I said yes for Isabel Reyes. I gave my reluctant permission, hung up the phone, and got dressed for a day I still fully expected to spend mostly invisible in the back row. When the standard graduation program began winding down toward its natural conclusion, the 300 families in the gymnasium started undergoing that familiar, collective shift in posture. People were adjusting their camera straps, gathering their coats, and preparing for the chaotic rush out to the parking lots. The formal presentation of the degrees was finished. Derek had returned to his seat near the front, with his diploma cover in hand, and my parents were practically glowing with the satisfaction of a scripted victory. Then, Dr. Patricia Aldridge, the dean of the engineering department, walked back to the central podium. She was an institutional presence who could command an entire room without ever raising her voice or relying on performative grandstanding. She carried a single, unadorned sheet of paper that had not been on the lectern during the rest of the ceremony. She stood before the microphone and simply paused. It was the heavy, deliberate pause of someone who is intentionally stepping completely off the standard agenda. The room instantly stilled. Dr. Aldridge looked down at her paper, then looked up into the crowded rows of the gymnasium. She announced into the microphone that before she delivered the official closing remarks, the university wanted to take an unscripted moment to recognize something extraordinary that had happened entirely behind the scenes of today's graduating class. She explained that over the past 4 years, 14 separate students, walking across the stage today, had benefited from a permanent scholarship endowment established by one of the university's own alumni. She said the fund was named the Hayes Mercer Engineering Scholarship, created to honor Walter Mercer, a civil engineer from the class of 1967, who spent his entire life believing that the most important structures were the ones nobody ever noticed. From my seat in the absolute last row, I watched my mother's head snap upward. In the front section, my parents looked like statues carved out of ice. The dean continued, her voice echoing perfectly through the rafters. She stated that the donor had explicitly requested zero public recognition or press when the fund was established, refusing every single invitation to speak or attend campus events over the last 4 years. However, she said the development office had discovered just that morning that the founder was actually sitting in the room today to watch her own brother graduate. She noted that, with the donor's highly reluctant permission obtained through a brief phone call, a few hours earlier, the university was going to break its silence. Dr. Aldridge looked past the front rows, past the middle sections, and pointed her eyes directly toward the dark corner of the very last row where I sat alone. "Lauren Hayes," the dean said, her voice steady and clear through the speakers. "Would you please stand?" The room didn't move all at once. It shifted in a massive rolling wave pattern as 300 heads rotated backward. Because of the specific geometry of a gymnasium, when you stand alone in the absolute back row, you become the most visible person in the entire building. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my muted gray blazer. I hadn't dressed for a celebration. I had dressed to be invisible. But as I stood there under the fluorescent lights, the dean shared a few more sentences about the kind of quiet philanthropy that expects absolutely nothing in return. She closed with a simple, genuine, "Thank you, Lauren," and the entire room erupted into applause. Standing under the fluorescent lights of that massive gymnasium, I didn't look at the crowd of strangers clapping for me. I looked down at the third row. My father turned his body with the slow, heavy rotation of a man whose entire social reality has just suffered a catastrophic structural shift. The expression on his face wasn't pure guilt. It was the specific, blank disorientation of someone who has just been handed a piece of hard data that completely demolishes a 30-year-old picture frame. He had to completely reevaluate who his daughter was in the span of a single heartbeat. My mother turned much faster. She had heard the dean attach my name to a sentence that placed me in a context she had never anticipated, never written, and never authorized. Her eyes locked onto mine across the 50 feet of empty space separating the front row from the back. We held each other's gaze for what I estimate was exactly 4 seconds. In the physics of human interaction, 4 seconds of absolute silence is long enough to communicate an entire ledger of truth. Her face didn't register pride. Let's be completely honest about that. People always expect a best moment like this to produce a sudden, magical awakening of maternal pride, but real life doesn't follow a cheap script. What I saw on her face was a complex, heavy calculation. It was the expression of an image manager who has just realized that her family narrative has an entirely massive, unauthorized chapter that she didn't write and doesn't own. She slowly looked down at the glossy program in her hands, turned it over to the back page, and found the small, unadorned line of text confirming everything the dean had just said. When she looked back up at me, the confidence had completely drained from her posture. The second the formal recessional ended and the music stopped, the room dissolved into the beautiful, chaotic choreography of 100 simultaneous family reunions. Caps were being tossed, cameras were flashing, and parents were navigating the crowded aisles to find their graduating children. I moved through that heavy crowd the exact way I moved through any active construction site, with a completely clear destination, absolute precision, and zero hesitation. I didn't head toward the third row. I had a much more important connection to make first. I found Isabel Reyes standing in the middle section, surrounded by an older couple who were beaming with the unmistakable joy of first-generation parents. Isabel looked small in her heavy graduation gown, carrying that specific, quiet intensity of a young professional who hasn't yet fully realized exactly how brilliant she is. I walked up and introduced myself. The moment my name left my mouth, she looked at me the way people look at a ghost that has suddenly stepped out of a ledger. She told me she had spent 3 straight years pleading with the university's development office, just to get a name, an email, or an address so she could send a proper thank you letter. She said she had written about her dream of being the first engineer in her family because she wanted whoever funded her to know that their sacrifice actually mattered. I looked at her and I smiled. I told her that it did matter. I told her I knew exactly what it felt like to be a first-generation element in a heavy field that doesn't offer you a family blueprint or a pre-poured foundation. I told her my grandfather had stood in her exact shoes 60 years earlier at this exact same university. Her eyes welled with tears, and she asked if she could hug me. We stood there in the middle of that roaring gymnasium crowd, and as she wrapped her arms around me, I knew that this single, unscripted moment of real human impact was the only true payoff my grandfather's endowment would ever need. After stepping back from Isabel, I turned to finally face the clearing near the front section where my parents were standing. My mother was still holding the printed program with the back page facing up, her fingers slightly wrinkling the glossy paper. Derek was a few feet away, laughing with his classmates, entirely unbothered. When he saw me approach, his face broke into that familiar, genuine warmth. He pulled me into a brief, tight hug and said, "Hey, Lauren, wasn't that absolutely wild what the dean said? I had no idea you set up a whole scholarship." He said it with the light-hearted surprise of someone who found a stray $20 bill in an old coat pocket, completely blind to the decades of heavy structural tension under his feet. I congratulated him on his degree, meant it sincerely, and watched him run back to join his friends for another photo. And then it was just the 3 of us standing in a cold, silent triangle. My mother spoke first. Her voice completely lacked that confident, carrying quality it had possessed 2 hours earlier when she branded me a disappointment in the back row. It had the specific flatness of someone who has held an indefensible position for so long that having it publicly contradicted leaves them completely without a posture to return to. She looked at the program and whispered, "Lauren, I didn't know. I didn't understand what you were doing with your life." Before she could finish, my father looked up from his shoes. His voice was slow. working through the heavy calculation of a man who only respects metrics he can count. He asked, "What was the total amount you gave them, Lauren?" $120,000, Dad, I replied evenly. The number hung in the air between us, heavy and unyielding. My father swallowed hard, looked away, and then said something I didn't expect. He didn't offer a dramatic apology. Instead, he simply stated what he had done, placing the raw fact between us like a cold measurement. He said, "I told Jim just before the ceremony started that Derek was my only successful child. I didn't know how to explain what you did." I looked at him, my expression completely unreadable. "I know you said that, Dad," I replied calmly. "I was helping with the dishes at Christmas 2 years ago. I heard you say the exact same thing through the kitchen wall. Today didn't change what I understand about this family. It only made the reality visible to 300 people who didn't previously know." My mother immediately tried to step in, her shoulders adjusting as she attempted to pivot into a brand new, polished script of maternal pride. She started saying how incredibly proud she was of my generosity, already assembling the updated story she would tell her friends at church next Sunday to incorporate my sudden prestige. I raised my hand slightly, stopping her mid-sentence. "I appreciate the thought, Mom," I said, my voice quiet but completely unshakable. "But I need you to understand something very clearly. I didn't establish this endowment to make you proud of me. I didn't write those checks as a secret message to this family, or as a performance to prove my worth to you. I did it because my grandfather believed in giving people a foundation, and I reached a point where I could extend what he gave me. That is the whole story. I have been building things quietly for 34 years, and I am going to keep building them. But I no longer require you to understand the buildings in order for them to stand. I'm not going to arrange my life to be legible to your story anymore. You are welcome to know me as I am, or not at all." She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, completely unable to find a counterscript. I picked up my work bag, wished them both a safe drive home, and walked out through the gymnasium's side exit into the bright afternoon sun. The 2.5-hour drive back to Nashville was the quietest drive of my entire life. About 40 minutes out, I pulled into a gravel rest stop, stepped out of the car, and looked at the low spring sun cutting through the trees at an angle. I pulled my grandfather's off-center steel level out of my bag, resting it flat across my palm. I thought about Isabel Reyes, promising to be a good engineer. I thought about my mother's pale face looking at the back of the program. I felt a deep, profound sense of completion. Not a petty satisfaction, but the clean, quiet resolution you feel when two massive structural joints finally lock together exactly the way they were designed to meet. The following Thursday, Derek called me from his apartment. He didn't call to offer a defensive excuse for our parents. He called to tell me that he had looked up the university's annual giving report and discovered the names of the students the scholarship had funded. He had recognized one of them, a classmate who had told him months ago that an anonymous gift had saved him from dropping out when his family hit financial ruin. Derek told me he had called that classmate, and they had both cried on the phone. Then he asked if he could drive down to Nashville in July so we could have dinner. Just the two of us, without our parents. I said yes. And when we finally sat down at a restaurant near the river weeks later, I discovered he was genuinely funny, deeply curious, and entirely willing to see me as a real person rather than a character in our mother's scrapbook. My parents didn't call me for 3 full weeks after the graduation. When my mother finally dialed my number on a quiet Sunday morning, the performance was completely gone from her voice. She didn't say she was proud. She simply admitted, with a raw, unpolished honesty I had never heard from her before, that she had spent so long managing the story of her family that she had completely confused the story with the actual people in it. We talked for 20 minutes about ordinary things, her sister's overgrown garden, and a problem with their front porch steps that my father had been avoiding. A few days later, my father sent me a crisp photograph of those sagging concrete steps. I took 2 minutes to look at the alignment, wrote him a precise 3-paragraph structural assessment, and texted him back, explaining that patching the surface texture wouldn't do a single thing because the underlying foundation had settled improperly. He needed to secure the base first. He sent back a single line, "Figured as much. Thank you, Lauren." It was the first time in my adult life he had ever typed my name in a message. I didn't celebrate it. I just noted it the way an engineer notes a data point, as something real, a tiny number that might finally mean something in a much longer calculation. If you are out there tonight sitting at your own kitchen table building something massive in the dark, while the people around you celebrate shallow things, I want you to remember what my grandfather taught me. At the edge of that concrete overpass, your work does not need a single person's applause to be entirely real. The scholarship was changing lives for 4 years before my name was ever spoken in that room. Build the real thing, not the pretty thing. Build it correctly and build it for the right reasons. The room will always fill up eventually, and your name will already be inside it. And when the people who doubted you finally walk through the door, you won't have to say a single word. The structure will say it for you. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. If you want more quiet nights like this one, where the truth arrives without anyone having to shout it from the rooftops, come find us on the channel. Subscribe, take care of your foundation, and I will see you in the next one.